This scan was commissioned to investigate the state of practice for anti-theft and anti-vandalism solutions that are adaptable to departments of transportation, that's specifically public sector departments of transportation. These departments use a lot of copper wire and fiber optics to facilitate electrical communications infrastructure. And so the idea behind this scan, kind of starting with why, is we use these copper wire lines and fiber optic lines for lighting systems for safety of the traveling public. We use it for communication systems for incident management. We use it for demand management purposes. We also use it, for example, for signal lights to control conflict points at grade. And so there's a lot of risks if these systems go down. And so the goal of the scan is really fourfold. First, we're looking at successful asset protection strategies. How do we harden the asset against vandalism or theft that could occur? We're also looking at emergent technology. How do we maybe deter these threats with some sort of technological solution that's coming on the market? And third, how do we structure our organization to tackle these challenges successfully? And fourth, a more externally focused, how do we partner with law enforcement agencies, communities, other stakeholders to make sure that we're having the most effective approach to addressing theft and vandalism issues that are occurring on public facilities? I think when we talk about major takeaways, it's important to first note the scope and the impact of the problem. What exactly are we talking about here when we talk about theft and vandalism occurring on public infrastructure? And I think we have to go back to why this scan was even ideated to begin with. We noticed here in California, especially in our urban areas, that costs related to theft, vandalism of those electrical and communications infrastructure were rising. One study that was conducted through the Mineta Institute through San Jose State University showed that between, I believe it was 2019 and 2020, just wire theft alone increased over 80% in terms of costs attributed to repairing those incursions in the facility. So those of course, they capture the labor, materials, equipment related costs, but there's a lot it doesn't capture. We don't know a lot of the actual costs, and that was one of the takeaways from the scan team. For example, what are the costs of the traveling public when the services go down, right? If we're only capturing internal expenditures for the department, what are the ancillary social costs? And then what are the costs that are passed on to even ratepayers and taxpayers and other fund sources? And part and parcel of that, what are the opportunity costs? What are we missing out on doing if we're investing so much in continuously repairing these systems over and over and over from vandalism and theft? So kind of that gap in what we know was a big takeaway from our team. Another one, when we talk about protecting the assets, there is no silver bullet solution out there. There is no design solution you could apply to every context and every situation and say, yeah, this really does it. This really works, and we can just leave it there and move on and make sure that we standardize whatever that solution is. It's really somewhat more like an arms race where we're trying to develop for public infrastructure continuously ways to protect them, and then those who are thinking about how to get into the systems and use them for their own purposes, they're also being innovative in terms of how they get in. And so a lot of times you can see like there's a progressive timeline there in terms of what we're trying to do as public servants, civil servants, to safeguard what we have out there, and then what others are trying to do to think around those barriers. There's also regional differences, solutions that work in places that, for example, never experience snow in the winter is very different from places that do. And so even when you're talking about the US as a whole, solutions that work really well in one area may not work well in others. And that's another thing to be cognizant of that we noticed. I personally was pretty impressed by just the innovators we have in the civil service arena here at our disposal. We have a lot of folks who've been part of thinking about this problem and in this industry area for decades, even serving the public in that capacity. And so, what I really thought was really cool is I thought I would be seeing a lot of like new technologies and emerging things we haven't tried before, but I was very impressed by the number of folks who are thinking about what do we already have? How can we be resourceful with that? How do we think creatively about what we have available and leverage that for protecting our assets? So that was a big takeaway I had personally. Um, Another interesting thing that we encountered was just the crossover between industries in terms of a shared interest in this issue. When you think about the idea that even on the highway system, there are electrical infrastructure going through there. There's communications infrastructure going through there. There's a big nexus between utility players and uh, public works infrastructure agencies. And then when if these crimes do actually happen, there's whether it's public property or private property, law enforcement sees it as a property crime, and so there's even kind of this cross-cutting nexus there in terms of different agencies being involved in different ways, but having the same angle on the issue. Um, One thing we noticed too is there's a focus from an agency or a stakeholder perspective on a jurisdiction, for example, a county boundary or a state boundary, like what do I have authority over to regulate or to address? And a lot of times, those boundaries help in terms of a focus and responsibility, but they can also hamper in terms of coordination. And so, better and stronger cross-industry coordination, I think, is a gap, a significant proven model that we identified, and I think it's exciting that we observed this is probably where we can take the scan in the future. We were blessed to have several distinct professionals serving on our scan team. We brought on as our subject matter expert Sean Nazari, who's retired from the California Department of Transportation after several decades of public service. We also have Michelle Cheney. She works for the Ohio Department of Transportation in District 4 as the traffic maintenance engineer. We also have Nathan Dominguez, who's part of the North Carolina Department of Transportation, supervising the ITS and signals unit, as well as David Gaffney, who manages the operations unit for the statewide traffic management center at the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, and Jason Shaddix, who is over ITS and systems operations for the Oregon Department of Transportation. And we also had two members from FHWA, Julie Johnston and Catherine Weisner, who are involved in utility engineering, value engineering, construction, contract administration, things like that. And our principal investigator is Harry Capers. Throughout the week of workshops we heard from several presenters, mainly from counterpart Departments of Transportation throughout the nation. We had Arizona Department of Transportation, Florida Department of Transportation, Minnesota Department of Transportation, Michigan Department of Transportation, and Washington Department of Transportation all give individualized presentations on this topic. We're also pleased to hear from the Eastern Transportation Coalition, which represents 20 states and the District of Columbia on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And we also heard from some industry and partner organizations and agencies, including utility companies, private industry, broadband companies, and law enforcement agencies. So we try to run the full gamut in terms of the presenters who were there. And I'm grateful for the many hours that our SCAN team and presenters have invested in this effort so far. We saw some great case studies throughout the entire week of workshops, and I think many of these deserve amplification and further consideration for adoption across the public sector and industry. Some of the more interesting ones we heard were technology that utilized drones. So there were like drone dogs, there was like drone in a box, uh, drones that either patrol your facilities or can be dispatched upon sensor detection. These are probably some of the more high dollar solutions. On the other more pragmatic solution side, we also heard a technology called the last gasp technology, where when power goes out to a certain element, a distress call goes up to people who may be detecting and can monitor and deploy resources. We also heard some success on agencies that were doing direct buried cable without conduit. And as I understand it, it can be very difficult to pull that kind of cable out of the ground. Another interesting case study we learned about that can be applied all probably in every context in every sector is the partnership with recycling facilities that take this scrap metal and understanding their needs, them understanding the issues that are going on in the field, and being able to uh, put our heads together on the problem, understand the issue and the indicators a bit more deeply. And I think this goes to probably the biggest takeaway I have from our entire week of workshops, and that's just tighter communications across the industry, more stakeholders involved. I think I'd call it task forcing between industry groups, public sector, public works agencies, law enforcement agencies, uh, recycling centers, public at large, any stakeholder who has a stake in the game. And I think at every level, local, regional, state, federal, we need to understand that we're not just talking about copper wires in the ground, fiber optics in the ground. We're talking about what they serve, and they serve the public. A lot of times, public safety, facilitation of mobility, uh, also the ability to respond during emergencies and things like that. And as I mentioned before, we don't know the true cost, the true social cost, the opportunity costs that come with this, and can probably envision a day where if we don't address it in a coordinated and focused manner, uh, it might be digging into our ability to operate a little more than it is today. And so we need to have probably consensus around that as a big issue across all jurisdictions and be able to get together, put our heads together, and figure out how we can leverage our unique strengths to tackle this problem. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that can be implemented at at a reasonable cost and can help develop relationships across different stakeholder groups to be able to figure out ways that address the problem effectively and can be implemented readily.